Mackenzie Shirilla claimed a sudden medical blackout caused her to crash at 100 miles per hour, but the vehicle's black box proved a terrifying truth. Her defense argued that postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, made her lose consciousness behind the wheel. But if she was completely unconscious, how did the car's computer record her steering with precision while flooring the gas to 100%? Today, we are dissecting the telemetry data that shattered the medical excuse and ultimately sealed her fate. Want to uncover the real facts behind the headlines? Subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now. We analyze the evidence together every single week. Before we get into the heavy data, we really have to talk about who was lost here. You know, when a case gets this much media attention, it's so easy to get caught up in the courtroom drama and the viral documentaries. But at the absolute center of this tragedy are two young men who had their entire lives ahead of them. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. Davion Flanagan was just 19. They were friends, they were sons, and they were brothers. The families of Dominic and Davion were forced into a nightmare that no one should ever have to wake up to. When we talk about this case, it is out of respect for them, because uncovering the truth of what happened that night is really the only way to honor what they went through. Wow, you just can't overstate the gravity of that loss, right? So, keeping them in our minds, let's look at how the police actually started to put the pieces together. When police and crash investigators arrive at a catastrophic collision, they don't usually start by looking for witness statements or listening to emotional testimonies. They start with the math. They look at the physical reality of the scene. The crash happened in July 2020 in Strongsville, Ohio. The police said the vehicle, a 2018 Toyota Camry, slammed into a commercial brick building. The damage was absolute. First responders were met with a horrific scene, but what happened in the seconds before that impact? That is where the case shifted from a tragic accident to a murder trial. The absolute foundation of the prosecution's case wasn't just a theory, it was the vehicle's event data recorder. We commonly call this the black box. I see a lot of people online arguing about witness accounts, but telemetry data cannot lie. It cannot have a personal bias, and it certainly does not take sides. It just strictly records physical reality. Prosecutors presented official court records showing the specific data pulled from that Camry. According to the police and the exact EDR readouts, the vehicle didn't just drift off the road. It accelerated from a normal driving speed to 100 miles per hour in just a matter of seconds. Let that sink in for a moment. 100 miles per hour on a local road. The data showed that the accelerator pedal was pushed down to 100% full capacity. Someone was flooring it. And more importantly, the black box recorded 0% brake application. The court records state that the brakes were never touched at any point before the car hit that brick wall. Not a tap, not a reflexive flinch, just zero braking. But speed and a lack of braking were not the only pieces of evidence the court had to look at. The steering data became the massive roadblock for the defense's medical blackout narrative. You see, the crash happened near the intersection of Plumbrook and Progress Roads. If you look at a map of that area, it is not a straight highway. It features a very specific sharp curve known as a dogleg intersection. To get through that curve without hitting the curbs early, you have to drive purposefully. The event data recorder logged active, calculated steering wheel adjustments right before the impact. The steering sensor proved that someone was making active, conscious inputs to successfully navigate the vehicle through that specific curve while the gas pedal was completely floored. This brings us to the core physical contradiction that the judge had to examine during the trial. The defense proposed that Mackenzie Shirilla suffered a sudden medical emergency that caused her to black out. They pointed to a condition she was diagnosed with called POTS. We will get deeper into what that is later, but essentially, they argued that a sudden drop in blood pressure caused her to completely lose consciousness behind the wheel. But prosecutors asked a very simple physics-based question in court. If a person undergoes sudden syncope, which is the medical term for fainting or passing out, the human body goes completely limp. Muscle tone relaxes. That is just how the human body works, right? So if a driver is truly unconscious, how could a limp, lifeless leg maintain full 100% downward pressure on an accelerator pedal for several seconds without fluctuating or slipping off entirely? Think about the physical mechanics of driving. It takes sustained, active muscle engagement to keep a pedal pressed all the way to the floorboard. If you pass out, your foot naturally relaxes and slides off or lets up on the pressure. And beyond the pedal pressure, the state asked how an unconscious person actively steers through a curved intersection. A limp body doesn't calculate the angle of a dogleg curve and adjust the steering wheel to stay on the pavement until the final target is reached. The prosecution argued heavily that the telemetry data showed someone who was entirely in control of the vehicle. They stated the data painted a clear picture of deliberate action, not an unpredictable medical accident. To the state, the 100% throttle position and the calculated steering inputs proved that Shirilla was awake, aware, and consciously driving that car into the wall. Let's pause and talk about what the police said during the investigation phase. When first responders got to the scene, it was chaotic. The sheer force of a car hitting a stationary brick wall at 100 miles per hour is devastating. The police had to reconstruct the scene using not just the black box, but tire marks, or rather the lack of skid marks, and camera footage from nearby businesses. Surveillance video from a business down the street captured the Camry flying past. The video corroborated exactly what the black box was saying. The car was under power, it wasn't coasting. I think it's really important to look at how the court viewed this. The judge in this bench trial had to weigh the defense's claim of a POTS episode against this hard mechanical data. A bench trial means there was no jury. The judge alone made the final decision. And the judge said that the evidence showed a deliberate mission of death. That is a very strong phrase for a court to use. But the court based that conclusion on the fact that the vehicle was operated with extreme precision right up until the end. If you put yourself in the courtroom and listen to the arguments, you can see the two completely different narratives trying to explain the exact same event. The defense is saying, look, she has a documented medical condition. POTS is real. People with POTS pass out. She passed out. And they are absolutely right that POTS is real. Nobody in the medical community is denying that POTS can cause fainting. But the prosecution said, yes, POTS is real, but a POTS blackout does not match the physical evidence of this specific crash. The police investigators testified about the mechanics of the Camry. The state explained that cars are designed to naturally decelerate if the driver is not actively pressing the gas. The moment you take your foot off, the RPMs drop and the car slows down. For the Camry to maintain that extreme speed and acceleration, a constant, heavy physical force had to be applied to the pedal. The state argued that you cannot apply constant heavy force if you are passed out cold, right? It just doesn't make physiological sense. And then there is the steering. The police said the data showed the steering wheel moving left and right, actively adjusting to the road. If you are unconscious, your hands might fall off the wheel, or your dead weight might pull the wheel sharply to one side, causing an immediate crash into a ditch or a guardrail. You don't perfectly trace the center of a lane through a curve if your brain is not sending active signals to your hands. Wow. When you really break down what the court was looking at, you start to see why the medical claims struggled to gain traction legally. It wasn't that the court didn't believe POTS existed. It was that justice demanded the court look strictly at the facts. The judge could not reconcile a fainting spell with the highly coordinated physical actions recorded by the car's computer. The families of Dominic and Davion had to sit through all of this. They had to listen to the technical breakdown of the last seconds of their sons' lives. I see people online talking about this case like it's just a casual debate topic, but for those families, every piece of telemetry data was a brutal reminder of the conscious choices that took their loved ones away. So the prosecution wanted to make sure the focus remained on the victims and the physical evidence rather than theoretical medical scenarios that didn't align with the math. So We have a situation where the medical excuse is put directly up against hard data. The defense has the burden of explaining how a blackout works in reverse, how a blackout causes a person to drive perfectly, yet recklessly, for a matter of seconds. The state, on the other hand, just has to point to the black box and say, the car did this because the driver told it to. This first piece of the puzzle, the telemetry, is what built the foundation for the entire murder conviction. Without the black box, it might have been a case of her word against the silent scene. But the car spoke. The car told the police exactly what happened. And what it told them was that there was no braking, there was full throttle, and there was active steering. As we move forward, we have to look closely at how the defense tried to fight this data, what they brought to the table regarding her medical history, and why the judge ultimately ruled the way she did. But right now, the black box stands as the most unyielding witness in the entire case. So we know the telemetry data was a massive wall for the defense to climb. The black box basically acted as the ultimate witness for the prosecution. But you can't just walk into a courtroom, look at the judge, and say the black box is lying. You have to explain why the car did what it did without the driver actively choosing to do it. To really understand the defense's strategy here, we have to define exactly what POTS is, based strictly on medical science, and look at how they tried to use it to explain away the crash. Postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, is a medically recognized condition that affects blood flow. It is very real, and it is a serious chronic illness. When a person with POTS stands up or experiences certain environmental or physical triggers, their autonomic nervous system struggles to regulate properly. This causes an abnormal and rapid heart rate spike. If you have ever stood up too fast and felt dizzy, imagine that multiplied drastically. For people living with severe POTS, this can lead to severe lightheadedness, extreme dizziness, and in some cases, complete syncope. Syncope is just the medical term for fainting or passing out entirely. During the legal proceedings, the defense attorneys argued that Mackenzie Shirilla did not intentionally drive into that commercial building to kill anyone. They had to give the court an alternative explanation for the 100-mile-per-hour speed. Instead of deliberate murder, they suggested that her POTS diagnosis was entirely to blame. They told the court that she suffered a sudden, severe medical blackout right there in the driver's seat. But remember what we talked about with the black box? The car showed the accelerator pedal pushed to 100% capacity and the steering wheel actively moving to navigate a curve. So how do you explain a perfectly placed foot and active steering if someone is passed out? In later statements and post-trial arguments, the defense tried to explain away this damning telemetry data. They argued that a person experiencing a severe autonomic panic or a sudden POTS flare-up might not just go completely limp. They suggested a different physiological response. They argued that the body might experience involuntary muscle stiffening or a locked physical response during an extreme panic event. Under this specific theory, her defense team said her foot could have rigidly locked onto the gas pedal involuntarily while she was completely unaware of her surroundings, out cold from the medical episode. They basically painted a picture of a medical paralysis where her foot became a dead weight pinned against the throttle. Wow. When you really think about that explanation, you have to look at it from the perspective of the victim's family sitting in that courtroom. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were just completely innocent passengers. Imagine being their parents, sitting on those hard wooden benches, listening to lawyers argue that a medical condition miraculously locked the driver's foot on the gas at the exact angle needed to reach 100 miles per hour, while simultaneously navigating a dogleg curve. It is incredibly heavy. The families of Dominic and Davion had to endure this deeply clinical breakdown of the very last terrifying moments of their sons' lives. We always have to keep our focus on the human experience here, because behind all the medical jargon and legal strategy, two families are just begging for the truth about why their boys are never coming home. If you haven't subscribed to U.S. Crime Cases, hit the button right now so we can keep bringing you the real facts every single week, right? So, the defense put this muscle stiffening theory out there, but here is where the entire medical defense completely fell apart. During the main trial, a critical deficit occurred. The judge ultimately rejected the medical claim altogether, famously referring to the defense's narrative on the record as a smokescreen. But why did the court dismiss it so easily? Was the judge just being dismissive of a chronic illness? No. It comes down to how the law actually works. You see, the official court record shows that during the initial bench trial, the defense team did not bring formal medical records, proving an active blackout happened at that exact time. Even more damaging to their case, they did not call a specialized medical expert to the stand. I see people getting confused by this online, so let's break it down simply. If you are in a high-stakes murder trial and your entire defense rests on a highly complex medical event, you cannot just have a lawyer stand up and tell the judge about it. Lawyers are not doctors. You need a licensed medical professional to sit in the witness box, look at the judge, and testify under oath. There was no licensed neurologist in that courtroom to scientifically explain to the judge how a POTS episode could legally account for the active steering and the 100% acceleration. Without an expert on the stand, the defense's theory about muscle stiffening was just that, a theory spoken by attorneys. The prosecution leaned heavily on medical counter-arguments, and because they were facing no live medical expert from the defense, they had the upper hand. The state maintained that syncope causes a loss of muscle tone. A person who faints drops, they go limp. They do not stiffen up like a board and perform calculated steering maneuvers while holding a pedal to the floor with maximum force. The prosecution argued that if you pass out, your leg relaxes. It slides off the pedal, or at the very least, the pressure fluctuates. The car's data showed a steady, unwavering depression of the pedal. Because the defense lacked a live medical expert during the actual trial to fight this specific point, the prosecution's narrative regarding the physical impossibility of the blackout claim went largely unchallenged in the courtroom. The judge had to look at the hard data from the police and the logical arguments from the state compared to a medical excuse that wasn't backed up by an expert witness when it mattered most. The court said the evidence pointed to intent, not illness. It was only after the guilty verdict came down that the defense scrambled to introduce new medical evidence. It was almost like a panic move after the fact. In a post-trial petition, they introduced findings from a university hospital's neurologist named Dr. Kamal Chamali. Dr. Chamali reviewed Mackenzie Shirilla's medical records and her autonomic nervous system data. Specialists like Dr. Chamali look at post-traumatic events and heart rate data to see if a medical emergency actually occurred. Now, this is where it gets highly debated. The defense wanted to use Dr. Chamali's review to prove the trial was unfair. The debate then became whether her symptoms right before the crash were classic POTS, or just an elevated heart rate caused by the sheer adrenaline, panic, and stress of actively driving a car at 100 miles per hour toward a brick wall. Think about it. If you are driving that fast and you're about to crash, your heart rate is naturally going to skyrocket. Your autonomic nervous system is going to be in absolute overdrive. The police said the telemetry showed she was driving aggressively. The prosecution would argue that, of course, her medical data might show panic and a spiked heart rate. She was in the middle of committing a horrific act. They argued it was the adrenaline of the crime, not a sudden onset of a chronic illness that would explain any physiological spikes. But the biggest problem for Mackenzie Shirilla wasn't just the debate over adrenaline versus POTS, it was the timing. By the time this expert review by Dr. Chamali was finally brought forward, the main trial was completely over. She had already been convicted of murder. The legal window to use this medical evidence effectively was closing extremely fast. In the legal system, you don't get unlimited chances to present your case. You have your trial, and you are expected to bring all your evidence and all your experts to that trial. If you try to bring new evidence after the judge has already banged the gavel, you have to jump through massive legal hoops. You have to prove that your original lawyers were so incompetent that they essentially deprived you of your constitutional rights. The court said that trying to introduce a neurologist after the verdict was essentially a day late and $1 short. When we look back at this section of the case, it is just stunning. We have a horrific crash that took Dominic and Davion away from their loving families. We have a driver surviving and blaming a very real medical condition for the tragedy. We have a defense team throwing out theories about locked muscles and involuntary stiffening. And then we have a total failure to put a doctor on the stand to back any of those claims up when the judge was ready to listen. It makes you wonder what would have happened if they had brought an expert during the trial. Would it have changed the judge's mind? Or was the black box data so overwhelmingly violent and precise that no doctor in the world could have convinced the court it was an accident? The reality is, the medical claims failed because they could not stand up to the physical math of the crash, and they were presented too late to legally matter. The defense gambled by not putting an expert on the stand, and that gamble ended up leaving the POTS excuse completely shattered on the courtroom floor. So let's take a step back and look at the prosecution's ultimate safety net. Even if we live in a hypothetical world where the defense could perfectly prove that Mackenzie Shirilla suffered from severe POTS and had a sudden catastrophic medical blackout, the prosecution had a massive legal counter-argument already locked and loaded. And this argument was based strictly on Ohio law. The state argued that if an individual truly possesses a severe, unmanaged medical condition that causes unpredictable, dangerous blackouts, and they absolutely know about it, they have a serious legal responsibility. You see, driving is not just a right, it is a profound responsibility, especially when you have other human beings in your car. The prosecution told the court that choosing to operate a vehicle at extreme speeds, especially while allegedly impaired by substances, as police noted at the scene, while knowing you are prone to passing out, still legally constitutes extreme conscious recklessness. Wow. When you really break down that legal philosophy, it makes a lot of sense. The prosecution essentially told the court that a chronic illness is not a free pass for reckless behavior. If you have a diagnosed condition where you know you might pass out at any second, you should not be pushing a car to 100 miles per hour with 2 passengers inside. You just shouldn't. We always have to bring this back to Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. These were 2 young men who got into that Toyota Camry trusting the driver. They trusted that they were going to get to their destination safely. They had families who loved them, parents who expected them to come walking back through the front door. When you are behind the wheel, you hold the lives of your passengers in your hands. A medical condition is a tragic burden for anyone to carry, but the court had to look at where personal accountability begins. If you know your body might shut down and you still decide to treat a local road like a racetrack, the law looks at that as a conscious disregard for human life. Right. I see exactly why the prosecution hammered that point home. It strips away the medical excuse and forces everyone to look at the choices made before the crash even happened. When it finally came time for the verdict, the tension in that courtroom was just crushing. The families had sat through days of agonizing technical legal data and legal debates about medical theories. The judge had to weigh everything: the lack of braking, the 100% acceleration, the active steering, and the defense's claims about POTS. And remember, this was a bench trial, so the judge was the sole decider of fact. The judge detailed her final reasoning thoroughly, and she based it strictly on the facts presented in the room. The court determined that the physical telemetry was simply undeniable. The active steering through that tricky dogleg curve and the sustained, unwavering floorboarding of the gas pedal scientifically proved intent and conscious control. The judge ruled that the event data recorder overrode any theoretical medical excuse that the defense tried to put forward. The court said the actions caught on the black box and the surveillance video were deliberate. The judge famously referred to the crash as a mission of death. That is an incredibly heavy statement from the bench, but it reflected the court's view that the physical evidence left absolutely no room for a medical emergency narrative. The gavel dropped and the convictions were secured. The telemetry closed the book on the medical excuse in the eyes of the trial court. But in the justice system, a guilty verdict is rarely the very end of the story. The defense knew they had made a massive mistake by not bringing a medical expert to the main trial, so they tried to fix it. This is where things get intensely procedural, but it is so important to understand how the system works. Later on, the defense's new appellate lawyers filed a post-conviction petition. This was their big chance to introduce Dr. Kamal Chamali's findings. They argued that her trial attorneys were ineffective because they only cursorily mentioned POTS and failed to bring in specialized medical experts to properly explain how a POTS-induced blackout could account for the collision. They wanted a new trial. They wanted a chance to put the medical data in front of a judge the right way. But this is where the strict, unyielding nature of the law comes into play. The defense's later attempts to appeal the case using Dr. Kamali's findings completely failed, and it wasn't even because the medical data was bad. It failed due to strict legal deadlines. The 8th District Court of Appeals looked at the petition and they threw it out. Why? Because the defense team filed it exactly one day late. I know, it sounds almost impossible to believe in a case with such high stakes, but it is the truth. Under Ohio state law, these specific petitions must be filed within exactly 365 days of the trial transcript being filed. Well, 2024 was a leap year. That extra day in February meant the 360th day landed on October 23rd, 2024. But her attorneys filed the petition on October 24th. Wow. Just let that sink in. One single day. The appellate court ruled that because the deadline was missed, they were completely without the legal authority to even consider the new POTS evidence. Their hands were tied by the calendar. On June 23, 2026, the Ohio Supreme Court officially declined to accept jurisdiction over the appeal, permanently cementing the lower court's dismissal. So what are we left with? We are left with a justice system that relied on hard vehicle data and a missed legal deadline. The murder convictions remain fully intact. But more importantly, we are left with two grieving families who have to carry the weight of this loss forever. Dominic and Davion are the real focus here. The legal maneuvering, the black box data, the missed deadlines, all of it is just the machinery of the aftermath. The data recorder captured the speed, the steering, and the total lack of braking. Does the telemetry completely close the book on medical excuse for you? We want to hear what you think. Share your thoughts using the facts below and subscribe as we continue to analyze true crime evidence objectively. Here are a few fact-based questions to consider as we look at how the court handled this evidence. Let's talk about them down in the comments. First, the defense suggested that a sudden medical panic could cause a driver's muscles to lock up on the gas pedal. However, the prosecution argued a true fainting spell makes the body go completely limp. Based strictly on the physical reality of the pedal being pushed 100% down, do you believe the black box data leaves any room for a medical emergency narrative? Second, during the main trial, the defense team did not call a certified medical expert to back up the POTS claim. In a high-stakes murder trial, should a judge completely dismiss a medical defense if it isn't supported by live expert testimony right there on the stand? Third, from a strict legal standpoint, if an individual knows they suffer from a chronic condition that can cause sudden lightheadedness or blackouts, does operating a vehicle at extreme speeds completely eliminate the unforeseen medical emergency defense? Where does personal accountability begin for you? And finally, later medical reviews by specialists analyzed her heart rate data post-incident. Does studying a patient's medical history after a crash change your perspective on whether the court should have weighed her chronic illness more heavily during the initial verdict? Thank you so much for staying till the end. We appreciate you. Please subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases for more factual and honest true crime.